The North Atlantic, just before dawn, has a sound unlike any other, a layered quiet that feels almost manufactured, as though the sea itself is holding its breath. On some mornings, the wind comes low and steady, brushing across the waves with the softness of cloth sliding across a table. On others, like this one, it carries a faint metallic edge, the kind that makes a man instinctively tighten his gloves and glance at the horizon. On this particular morning in the late winter of 1943, aboard the American destroyer USS Schenck, the cold had settled deep into every surface, into steel bulkheads, into anti-aircraft gun housings, even into the canvas stretched around the bridge wings. Men paced their watch rotations, stamping their feet, pulling breath through half-frozen scarves, and staring into a darkness where nothing seemed to move, nothing except the faint, steady sweep of their new radar set. The phosphor-green trace on the scope made a soft clicking sound each time. The antenna completed its rotation. It was barely loud enough to notice, but in the pre-dawn stillness, it felt unnervingly sharp. This sound was the reason the ship was out here. This sound was also the reason a German submarine commander, somewhere beneath the same black ocean, was slowly feeling the boundaries of his world collapse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For the Americans on the destroyer, the glow of the radar display had already become part of life at sea. They trusted it the way a navigator trusted the stars implicitly, instinctively, even reverently. The operator this morning was a young man from Ohio, scarcely 20, who turned the range dial with the confidence of someone tuning a familiar instrument. He leaned slightly closer, eyes narrowing. Something faint had flickered across the edge of the display. Contact. Weak, intermittent, disappearing between sweeps. Not a ship, not a surface echo. Something attempting to hide. He called out quietly to the officer of the deck, and the officer stepped closer, his face lit by the circular green glow. There, again just a nudge of light at the edge of the scope, not enough to classify, but enough to suggest that something moving very slowly had surfaced long enough to betray itself. The officer did not raise his voice. He simply said, "Hold that bearing. Call the captain." In that moment, a question began to form that would define the next hours. Why would a German submarine surface in these waters during the blackest hour before dawn? The old rules of the Atlantic War said that this was the submarine's hour, when darkness hid periscopes and exhausted lookouts stared into empty horizons. But the old rules were dissolving. By this point in the war, American escorts had an invisible advantage the Germans could neither see nor counter, an advantage that could detect a surfaced submarine long before the submarine could spot the ship hunting it. The irony was bitter and deep. German submariners had been taught to fear destroyers because of depth charges, the thunderous explosions that crushed ribs, burst eardrums, and hammered pressure hulls inward. Yet by 1943, it was not the explosive power of the Allied surface fleet that was killing the U-boats. It was the quiet hum of a radar set, turning on a mast, sweeping the sky and the sea with a pulse of energy that no human eye could detect. An energy that betrayed the submarine before a single depth charge was even prepared. Somewhere miles away, a German commander named Oberleutnant zur See Karl-Heinz Schmidt was coming to the same realization. His boat, whatever number historians would later identify only from patrol logs and fragmentary survivor testimony, had surfaced to recharge batteries. The crew had been running on the edge of exhaustion 20-hour days. Stale air, thin rations, nerves frayed by weeks of escort aircraft appearing unexpectedly out of clouds or from behind the curvature of the sea. They had begun this war taught to believe they were the hunters. Now they lived with the constant suspicion that they were being watched by machines they did not understand. And on this morning, the suspicion proved correct. Schmidt had risen to the conning tower, still pulling on his gloves when his lookout shouted a warning. A faint shape on the horizon, no more than a smudge against the dark. Too faint for the eye to interpret, but unmistakably present. It did not look like a destroyer's silhouette, but the mere possibility was enough. Schmidt ordered an immediate crash dive, the men dropping into the boat as the upper deck angled downward. The ballast tanks flooded with a familiar groan. Water poured through vents. The diesel engines cut out as electric motors took over. The boat sank beneath the surface. Just as the shape grew slightly clearer, there had been no time to reason through how the enemy had appeared so suddenly, no time to grasp that this was no accident of lookout skill or moonlight. It was the first moment of fear that radar brought into a U-boat. Not the explosion of a depth charge, not the violence of machinery under pressure, but the quiet terror of being seen in the dark. The sea closed over U. Schmidt's boat as the destroyer USS Schenck adjusted course toward the faint contact. The Americans could not hear the German crew scrambling to secure hatches, rotating to silent running, checking gauges in the red emergency lighting of the control room. They could not see Schmidt gripping the periscope handles, trying to confirm whether the shape he'd glimpsed was a destroyer, a merchantman, or some new Allied trick. They could not feel the shift in the boat's atmosphere as carbon dioxide levels began to rise, and the men forced themselves to breathe shallowly, silently. But the Americans did not need to see or hear any of that. The radar saw enough. In this moment lay the central question of the story. How did an invisible technology, one that never touched a pressure hull or exploded underwater, become more feared than the very weapons designed to destroy submarines? How did radar, quiet, clinical, and non-lethal by itself, reshape the psychology of the men who once ruled the Atlantic with stealth? To answer that question properly, one must understand the world the German submariners believed they lived in during the early phases of the war. When the first U-boats sailed in 1939 and 1940, they did so with a fierce confidence, not simply in their boats, but in their doctrine. The German Navy taught them that darkness was their ally, that the surface was their playground, and that Allied escorts were blind at night. Radar existed only in theory to them. It was not considered a threat. Their own equipment lagged years behind, and even the top-ranking officers in the U-boat arm underestimated what British and American engineers were building. But by the time the USS Schenck leaned carefully toward that faint contact on the radar screen, the world below the waves had changed. The Germans did not yet know how completely. They only sensed it, often in moments just like this one, a vague shape on the horizon appearing without cause, an aircraft arriving out of empty sky, a destroyer turning toward them long before periscope lenses could detect movement. During the first years of the war, German propaganda and naval doctrine had built a striking mythology around the U-boats. They were the new commerce raiders, modern successors to the surface cruisers of the previous war. They would cut Britain's lifeline, drown convoys under coordinated wolf pack attacks, and conduct the war on their own terms. And for a time, those beliefs held true. The early patrols achieved extraordinary success. Merchant ships burned, alone in the mid-Atlantic, and the U-boat commanders became national heroes, celebrated in newspapers and newsreels. This was the world young seamen, like the men on U. Schmidt, were taught to believe in. A world where careful seamanship, night attacks on the surface, and the inherent stealth of the submarine offered all the advantage they needed. They knew the enemy destroyers were dangerous, of course. Every man in the U-boat arm lived with the image of depth charges rolling off a stern rack, sinking slowly through the gloom, before detonating with a violence that shook bones and buckled steel frames. But they also believed depth charges could be defeated by skill by diving deep, changing course, accelerating away, and running silent. They believed that a submarine commander's wits could outmatch an escort's noise, confusion, and limited detection range. That belief system formed the psychological armor of the U-boat arm. It was what allowed men to volunteer for service in steel tubes designed to operate for months at a time in the most hostile environment imaginable. It was what let them listen to the creaking of pressure hulls at depth and still trust that they could survive. But radar undermined that entire foundation in a way no explosive ever could. Depth charges were a threat the Germans could hear, feel, and understand. Radar was a threat they could neither perceive nor fight. They had no sensory relationship to it. There was no hum inside the U-boat when a destroyer was painting them with radar, no alarm to warn them, no instinct that could sense a pulse of electromagnetic energy bouncing off their conning tower. To a U-boat commander trained to read the sea through sight, sound, and ship-handling intuition, radar was a weapon that made the ocean feel haunted. By the time the Americans and British deployed their first reliable centimetric radar sets, U-boat doctrine had not yet adapted. German engineers had no effective radar detectors for these frequencies, and even when they introduced the early METOX and later Naxos receivers, these devices were insufficient or flawed. METOX could detect longer wavelength radar, but by 1943 the Allies were largely using shorter wavelengths that it could not sense. Naxos could detect some centimetric emissions, but its range was too short to provide safety. Many commanders discovered this only when it was too late, when radar-guided aircraft were already moving in. The psychological shift began slowly, almost imperceptibly, in patrol logs and survivor accounts. German commanders started reporting encounters they could not explain. Aircraft attacking through heavy cloud cover, destroyers appearing at night despite calm seas and minimal silhouette, convoy escorts maneuvering toward them, even when the submarine ran without excess noise. These were not random coincidences. They were the first symptoms of a fundamental imbalance between German belief and Allied technological reality. It is important to understand the material conditions of a U-boat in these years to grasp why radar had such impact. The boats were cramped, with barely enough space for the crew to move freely. Torpedoes shared sleeping compartments with sailors. Condensation dripped constantly from pipes along the ceiling. The atmosphere became stale within hours of submerging. Men lived with the perpetual odor of diesel fuel, machine oil, and unwashed clothing. The emotional stress of long patrols, sometimes lasting months, wore away at even the most seasoned crewmen. And yet, for many, the surface at night had always offered relief. Fresh air, open sky, a chance to run faster on diesel engines, recharge batteries, and escape the oppressive confinement of submerged operation. Radar took the night away from them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It forced them to remain submerged far longer than their boats were designed to endure. It condemned them to slow speeds, limited visibility, and battery drain. It deprived them of the one advantage that had once made their boats the most feared weapon in the Atlantic. This is the world that Oberleutnant Schmidt inhabited on that winter morning, one where every decision carried consequences shaped by an invisible enemy he could not sense. He had dived the boat instinctively, trying to regain the safety that the doctrine of earlier years had promised. But as the destroyer turned more sharply toward the contact shown on the American radar display, a new truth was beginning to reveal itself. The Germans were no longer simply fighting Allied ships, they were fighting Allied science. And the science was winning. The destroyer closed the distance slowly, deliberately, almost patiently. There was no urgency in the movements of the officers on the bridge, no sense that they were groping through the dark, hoping for confirmation. They moved with the confidence of men who already believed the sea had given up its secret. The radar contact was faint, yes, but it was steady. Each sweep returned the same fragile echo, the same whisper of a metallic shape lingering just long enough above the waves to reflect energy back toward the ship. Inside the USS Schenck, the watch changed with subdued efficiency. Men stepped quietly around each other on the bridge, boots thudding lightly on the cork-covered deck. A new radar operator slid into the chair, adjusting the headset. The set was an SG surface search radar, operating on a wavelength that could pierce through weather and darkness with a resolution the Germans still underestimated. The antenna rotated above the ship with a soft mechanical whine, barely audible above the rhythm of the ship cutting through the sea. The captain arrived on the bridge without ceremony. His coat collar was pulled up against the cold. He took one look at the radar screen and understood the situation immediately. "Probably a U-boat that surfaced too long," he said quietly, "or one that thought we couldn't see her." He didn't add the rest of the thought that German submarines still behaved as though the ocean belonged to them at night, that they still believed their own doctrine even as it failed them, that somewhere beneath that patch of ocean was a commander struggling to understand how the Americans had closed the gap so quickly. Below the waves, Schmidt settled at depth. The control room was filled with the soft pinging of the depth gauge, the quiet hum of the electric motors, the muted voices of men speaking just above whispers. They had descended to a depth that felt safe, though every submariner knew safety was transient. The hull creaked in its familiar way as the pressure increased. Seawater pressed against steel plates and rivets. The boat leveled off, and the crew began switching to silent running, shutting down anything that wasn't essential. Schmidt wiped condensation from the periscope eyepiece and raised the instrument just enough to break the surface. He scanned with slow, practiced sweeps. Nothing. Only darkness and the faint suggestion of pale water in the distance. No silhouettes, no bow waves, no destroyer, which made the sighting all the more troubling. He lowered the periscope and stood for a moment in the cramped space, one hand braced on the metal housing. He could feel the tension of his men. He could hear the uncertainty in their movements. He could sense, because every U-boat commander developed this sense, the subtle shift in morale that happened when the ocean behaved in ways their training could not explain. He knew the Americans were improving their detection systems. Rumors had circulated through bases in France and Norway. Some said Allied aircraft could find a submarine even through cloud cover. Others claimed the British had created a device that could detect U-boat radio signals with uncanny accuracy. But radar, the real radar, the centimetric system the Allies now depended on, remained mysterious to most German crews. They knew the word, but not the physics. They knew the effect, but not the mechanism. Schmidt exhaled slowly and finally said to his men, "We stay down for now. No risks, no surfacing until night turns fully." But night had already turned. Dawn was coming, and with dawn came aircraft. The destroyer USS Schenck had already radioed the escort carrier supporting the convoy several dozen miles away. The message was brief but unmistakable. Possible submarine contact, radar bearing steady. Within minutes, aboard the carrier, flight crews were being roused from their bunks. Mechanics moved under red lighting across the hangar deck, preparing a Grumman TBF Avenger for launch. Pilots strapped into gear, still warm from sleep. The launch officer checked wind direction, deck pitch, and orders. The carrier did not need to be close. Radar had given enough bearing and distance information to vector aircraft into a search pattern with remarkable precision. The young aviators did not know which U-boat they were hunting, nor did they need to. They had a bearing, a general location, and confidence in the radar readings from the destroyer. Schmidt had none of that. His boat crouched beneath the Atlantic like an animal hiding from a predator it could not see, aware only that danger lurked somewhere above. Hours passed. The crew rotated through quiet shifts, conserving energy and air. Schmidt's face remained stern, focused, but his thoughts were not entirely on tactical decisions. He was remembering earlier patrols early in the war, when the Atlantic had seemed empty of threats, when night surface attacks were orchestrated with calm professionalism rather than desperate caution, when merchant ships appeared like helpless silhouettes against the stars, and destroyers were too far away or too few to interfere. He remembered the smell of fresh air on the bridge, the feel of wind on his cheeks, the thrum of diesel engines running at full speed, the exhilaration of closing with a convoy unseen, a predator gliding through darkness. But radar had stolen that world. Every hour submerged meant depleted batteries. Every attempt to rise to periscope depth risked detection. Every surfaced charge was a gamble. Every decision now sat beneath a shadow, the suspicion that the Allies had learned to see in the dark. As the morning progressed, the U-boat's battery gauge edged downward, slowly at first, then more perceptibly. The chief engineer approached Schmidt with a thin ledger of numbers: projected endurance, remaining charge, recommended surfacing window. The numbers were not reassuring. Schmidt understood. They had to surface soon, or risk being stuck at a depth where maneuverability would degrade and emergency dives might be impossible. But surfacing in daylight felt suicidal. He ordered the boat to rise slowly. Not to the surface, but to periscope depth. The boat ascended silently, seawater gliding down the hull in muted streams. Schmidt raised the periscope again, slower this time, as though slowness could guarantee safety. He scanned. Fog. Clouds. Low. Shifting visibility. For the first time that day, he felt a small moment of relief. Poor visibility meant aircraft could not see them. Aircraft were the terror of every U-boat commander by this stage of the war. A destroyer could be outmaneuvered or evaded. A well-handled submarine could escape depth charges with luck, skill, and silence. But aircraft? Aircraft struck from angles a commander could not anticipate. Aircraft came swiftly, with little warning, carrying depth bombs or acoustic homing torpedoes. The fog gave him courage, just enough to order the boat a little higher, just enough to consider surfacing briefly to recharge and refresh the air. And so he did. The conning tower broke the surface with a quiet rush of water. Diesel engines rumbled to life. Fresh air poured into the boat, and for a moment the mood lightened. Men inhaled deeply, as though returning to a world they'd been exiled from. The horizon remained empty. The fog swirled gently, providing cover. But radar was not hindered by fog. Above them, in the cold air several thousand feet up, the pilot of the TBF Avenger saw nothing through his cockpit. Nothing except the readings from his own radar set an ASV unit capable of locating surfaced submarines even in near-zero visibility. He turned his aircraft slightly, narrowing the search pattern, trusting the instrument the same way the destroyer crew had trusted theirs. The contact appeared, a single blip, steady, growing. He keyed the microphone and spoke calmly. "I have a return. Looks like a surfaced sub. Fog layer thick, no visual yet. Moving to attack run." Below, Schmidt finally heard something, a dull drone in the distance. At first, he thought it might be the engines of a merchant ship or the faint echo of a distant destroyer. But the tone grew sharper, more insistent. He froze, listening. The officer beside him whispered, "Aircraft." Schmidt did not hesitate. Crash, dive, 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 dive. Chaos erupted. Men scrambled. The watch crew dropped through the conning tower hatch, sealing it behind them. The engines cut out. The boat angled steeply downward as ballast tanks flooded. Tools clattered. Water hissed. Bodies slammed into bulkheads as the boat descended. But in the fog above, the aircraft pilot had already released his depth bombs. The explosions detonated just after the U-boat slipped beneath the surface, missing by enough distance to spare the hull but close enough to send shock waves pulsing through the water. Inside the boat, lights flickered. Men braced themselves, valves rattled. The bombs had not struck, but they had accomplished their purpose. They had forced the U-boat under, and once submerged, radar would continue the hunt through the destroyer. Hours later, when the USS Schenck arrived in the area coordinated by the aircraft, the Americans began a different kind of search. Not with radar this time, but with the technology that followed radar like a second set of claws sonar. The destroyer's operators sent sound pulses into the deep, listening for the echo of steel in water. They found it. The sonar returned a contact, clear, hard, the unmistakable signature of a submarine hull. There was no guesswork now, no chance encounter, no uncertainty. Radar had found the submarine. Aircraft had suppressed it, sonar had pinned it, and depth charges would finish the job. Below, Schmidt listened to the first distant pings of the destroyer's sonar, each one a soft tap travelling through the hull. His men stared at him, waiting. He knew the truth they all feared. Their position was already compromised. How the Americans had found them still felt inexplicable, but the fact of it could not be denied. "We go. Deep," Schmidt said. They dove. The destroyer adjusted course. The pings grew louder, sharper. Depth charges rolled off the stern. Explosions shook the boat. Lights jolted. Equipment fell. Men gripped pipes and bunks to steady themselves. The hull groaned under the shock waves, air filled with the scent of ozone from sparking wires. Another wave of depth charges detonated. The boat lurched violently. Schmidt steadied himself, one hand on the chart table. He felt the weight of the moment, the terrifying recognition settling into his mind with clarity. They were not here because a lookout had failed. They were not here because the ocean betrayed them. They were here because the Americans had learned to see through darkness, through fog, through the very conditions the U-boat arm once relied on for survival. This was the new war, a war where the submarine was no longer the hunter, a war where radar had changed the balance not through force, but through knowledge. Another explosion rocked the boat. Bulkheads rattled. A pipe burst, spraying water. The engineer shouted, "Damage reports." And still, beneath it all, Schmidt heard the rhythm of sonar pings, methodical, unhurried, almost clinical, the sound of a predator tracking prey with instruments rather than instincts. On the surface, the USS Schenck prepared a final pattern of depth charges. The captain stood on the bridge, watching the sea churn where the U-boat had vanished. He did not speak dramatically. He did not celebrate. He simply gave quiet orders based on radar readings, sonar echoes, and the cold precision of anti-submarine warfare doctrine. Several minutes later, a final depth charge exploded. Then silence returned. Bubbles rose. Oil slicked the surface. But no wreckage appeared. The destroyer waited, circling. Eventually, the sea flattened again. Radar swept. Sonar listened. Nothing. The contact was gone. And with it, one more fragment of the belief system German submariners had once clung to with unwavering faith. The Atlantic was calm by late afternoon, its surface deceptively peaceful. The USS Schenck cut through the water at a steady patrol speed, the crew working in efficient silence, the excitement of the earlier hunt already settling into memory. Anti-submarine warfare had become a routine, almost mechanical process: radar contact, aircraft vector, sonar localization, depth charge pattern. There was no romance left in it, no drama, only process. But below that surface, somewhere in the dim green twilight where sunlight faded into pressure and cold, Schmidt hung suspended in a state between survival and collapse. The last attack had stunned the boat. The hull still shuddered occasionally from aftershocks. A battery cell had cracked, releasing choking fumes. Water seeped through 2 bulkheads, though not yet at a catastrophic rate. Electric motors hummed unevenly, gauges flickered. The air tasted metallic, laced with sweat and chemical residue. Schmidt stood in the control room, feeling the heartbeat of his boat through the decking beneath his boots. The quiet tapping of the sonar pings was gone. The destroyer had moved off, searching elsewhere. But silence was as dangerous as sound. Silence meant the Americans were confident enough to wait patiently. Silence meant they believed radar and sonar had done their work. His first officer approached, face pale in the dim red lighting. Herr Kaliun, the engineer reports the batteries will not last to nightfall. At this discharge rate, we will lose propulsion. Schmidt closed his eyes for a brief moment. He felt the shape of the situation forming around him like the walls of a tightening pressure hull. He could neither surface, the destroyer would detect them again, nor stay submerged. A commander in earlier years might have gambled on outrunning destroyers under cover of night. But in 1943, night was no longer an ally. Radar watched the night sky with eyes that did not blink. He opened his eyes. How long? 2 hours, perhaps 3. Not long enough. A whisper of resignation moved through the crew like wind through dry grass. Men exchanged glances, not panicked, but knowing. U-boat sailors had long understood the sea could take them at any moment, yet this felt different. This felt impersonal, not a battle between hunter and hunted, but an equation whose variables had already been solved. Schmidt steadied himself. We will attempt a silent drift. Shut down everything we can. Hold depth manually. The order spread through the boat. Switches flipped. Motors wound down. Lights dimmed further. The boat became a drifting shadow, barely moving, suspended in a cold void. As the crew fell into the tense stillness of survival, Schmidt withdrew to the tiny navigation compartment. He removed his cap, ran a hand through his damp hair, and stared at the chart spread beneath a flickering lamp. The pencil lines traced their path across the Atlantic. Departure from Lorient, a planned intercept route along the convoy lanes. Then an abrupt turn, a desperate dive, and a forced descent into uncertainty. He realized something with painful clarity. His tactics were outdated. The war had outpaced him, not through superior courage or numbers, but through invisible beams of energy sweeping across the ocean's surface. He was fighting a war of 1,941 with tools of 1,943. No amount of skill could change that. He thought of the young men under his command, some not yet 20, men who'd believed the U-boat arms mythology, who'd grown up on stories of men like Gunther Prien and Otto Kretschmer, heroes who'd stalked the Atlantic with daring brilliance, men who had once returned to parades and medals. None of those stories mentioned centimetric radar. None mentioned the sudden brutal shift from hunter to hunted. The lamp flickered again. Then it went dark. Another battery system failing. Schmidt slipped the map back into its case and rejoined. The crew. The destroyer's sonar had gone quiet. The contact was lost. The captain considered it for several moments, then spoke quietly to his XO. She might have gone deeper. Or we got her. The XO nodded. Should we drop a confirming pattern? Negative. No need. The convoy's priority. Radar sweep continues. There it was, the indifferent efficiency of Allied doctrine. They didn't need confirmation. They didn't need to see debris. Their goal wasn't individual victories. It was maintaining the safety of shipping lanes, neutralizing threats before they could strike. Radar had made U-boats less like monsters and more like mathematical problems. The USS Schenck turned to rejoin the convoy. The ocean swallowed its wake. Breathing grew heavier in the stale air. Sweat collected on brows. Condensation dripped from pipes. Men lay quietly in bunks, conserving oxygen. The chief engineer whispered, "Updates battery levels, rising CO2 content. Temperature, 2 hours. Passed. Then 3. The boat grew warmer. The air grew thinner. Finally, the engineer approached Schmidt with a blunt, emotionless report. We must surface. Immediately. Schmidt looked around the control room. He saw exhaustion. He saw determination. He saw men who trusted him. He nodded. Prepare to surface. All hands at stations. The boat rose slowly, painfully. Ballast tanks blew in short bursts to avoid sudden noise. Pressure changed. The hull moaned as it climbed toward brighter water. Schmidt braced himself at the ladder leading to the conning tower. The boat breached the surface. He unsealed the hatch. Sunlight struck him like a blow. Cold, clean air rushed in. He gasped reflexively. And then, silence. No destroyer. No aircraft. Just empty ocean, stretching in all directions. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe they might escape. The fog earlier had dispersed. The sea glimmered under late afternoon light. He turned, scanning the horizon with careful, sweeping movements. Still, nothing. He ordered the diesel engines started. The boat began moving eastward at a cautious speed. But the moment the exhaust plumes rose into the air, the moment the boat began making that telltale signature on the surface, miles away, a radar operator aboard the escort carrier saw something, a faint blip, barely there. But steady. He reported it calmly. And just as calmly, a flight crew prepared another aircraft. Within minutes, another Avenger thundered down the deck and lifted into the sky. Schmidt had only 15 minutes of false hope before the lookout screamed, "Flugzeug! Bearing 080, diving toward us!" He shouted the only order left, "Crash dive!" The boat descended again. The engines died, hatches slammed shut, men scrambled, but this time they were too slow. The aircraft dropped 2 depth bombs mere seconds after the conning tower slipped beneath the waves. The detonations were tremendous. The hull buckled, lights shattered, pipes burst. The forward compartment flooded instantly. Men screamed. Schmidt ordered the watertight doors sealed. He knew what that meant for the men inside, but the alternative was losing the whole boat. The surviving compartments filled with chaos. Water surged down passageways. Gauges spun madly. Sparks rained from overhead panels. Another explosion tore through the stern. Now, the U-boat listed sharply, sinking uncontrollably. In the darkness, illuminated only by emergency lamps and cascading seawater, Schmidt gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. He shouted orders until his voice broke. But the boat no longer responded. The Atlantic had claimed it. As the bow angled downward, he realized something with grim certainty. He had never seen the enemy who killed him. Not once, not a destroyer, not an aircraft, only radar. The boat plunged deeper. The hull creaked. Then it groaned. Then it buckled. A single, echoing crack signaled the end. Schmidt imploded in the cold silence of the deep. The destroyer never saw wreckage. The aircraft pilot never confirmed a kill. The carrier's radar operator never knew the blip he saw represented the final breath of 60 men. But in Kriegsmarine command centers, especially after dozens of boats vanished without ever sighting an enemy, German analysts began piecing together the truth. Reports from survivors of other U-boats spoke of destroyers appearing out of pitch-black nights with no visible cues. Aircraft descending from clouds without warning, perfect interceptions in heavy fog, attacks launched before the submarine even knew it had been detected. Rumours solidified into fear. Fear became doctrine. Doctrine became panic. Soon, German submarine commanders began refusing night surface attacks entirely. They crept at periscope depth, blind, slow, vulnerable. Dönitz issued desperate orders to restore aggressiveness, but aggressive tactics no longer worked. The Allies could see everything. U-boat losses skyrocketed. By 1943, the U-boat arm, once the pride of Germany, became a graveyard of steel and men. And this is why German submariners feared American radar more than depth charges. Depth charges they could hear, they could evade, they could outmaneuver, but radar? Radar was a ghost, a presence, an unseen observer. It turned the entire surface of the Atlantic, once the U-boat's sanctuary, into a killing ground. No sound, no warning, no chance. Most terrifying of all, radar robbed them of the two things every submariner depended on: night and silence. For centuries, darkness had been the natural ally of anyone hiding at sea, but radar made darkness meaningless. It turned the ocean into a chessboard and U-boats into pieces, moving according to rules they no longer understood. Just before U. Schmidt's hull collapsed under pressure, just before the deep Atlantic crushed steel and bone alike, Schmidt had one final thought, simple, clear, calm. It was not the depth charges that found us. It was the eyes above the ocean, eyes we never saw. That was the true power of radar. It made men fear not the explosions that killed them, but the unseen force that found them in the first place. In the years after the war, long after the steel hulls had rusted into the Atlantic floor and the last survivor testimonies had been recorded, a quiet truth settled across naval history. The Battle of the Atlantic had been won not by greater numbers, nor by brute force, but by an invisible revolution. A revolution measured in wavelengths, not tonnage. At Allied laboratories, MIT's Radiation Lab, British coastal stations, Canadian research centres' engineers had unleashed a technology that shifted the meaning of night itself: centimetric radar, radar that pierced fog, rain, cloud cover, radar that bounced off a U-boat's conning tower from miles away, painting its position with mathematical precision, radar that let destroyers hunt at midnight with the confidence of daylight. What terrified German commanders most was not the explosions. It was the realization that the ocean, once vast, forgiving, and unknowable, had become transparent. After the war, captured U-boat officers spoke quietly about this transformation. They described moments when destroyers materialized out of starless nights, when aircraft appeared through cloud walls as if conjured from thin air. They spoke of attacks coming from angles no human lookout could have spotted. Again and again, they returned to the same word: uncanny. And beneath that word lay something deeper. We were being watched. Even Dönitz, supreme commander of the U-boat arm, admitted in post-war interrogations that the Allies' ability to locate submarines had become incomprehensible. He believed, until the very end, that some hidden espionage network or broken cipher was responsible. The truth was stranger. It was simply physics applied ruthlessly, relentlessly, with industrial precision. By 1943, U-boat crews no longer feared weather, nor convoys, nor even destroyers. They feared the sky, not because of the aircraft within it, but because the sky had become filled with invisible eyes, rotating dishes, antenna masts, airborne scanners, all sweeping, probing, searching. A U-boat surfacing after dusk felt exposed not to a human enemy, but to an omnipresent force, a presence that sensed metal in darkness, a presence that never slept. This was the psychological victory of radar. It robbed the submariner of control. It turned every surfacing into a gamble. It made every mile of open ocean feel like a trap. And so, the final irony of the Atlantic campaign is that the weapon which ended the U-boat threat was not fired, dropped, or detonated. It simply observed. A beam of energy, a returning echo, a tiny blip on a green glowing screen. In that blip lay the collapse of an entire strategy. In that blip lay the end of an era. German submariners had once ruled the Atlantic by mastering darkness. Radar created a new kind of darkness, one where shadows could no longer hide anyone. And in this new darkness, the hunters became the hunted forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.